Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this radio, audio, no pictures live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about a number of studies or alleged studies. In my opinion, they're all propaganda, but a number of studies doing the rounds in the United States that assert or claim that racial segregation in schools, and I'm talking here primary schools, in middle school, high school, is worse now. Their assertion is worse now than it was in the 1950s, or worse than in the days when it was policy in some areas of the United States to segregate, so to racially segregate. Now, let's just have a look at this. The first thing to look for is well, who's making the study, who's commissioning the study, who's carrying it out, how sort of balanced and impartial and peer reviewed, and is it is the study conducted to the highest level of scholarly standards? Is it just a bunch of race hustler activists getting together and pumping out propaganda? Now, straight away, you have a look at the sources of these, certainly the ones that I've seen anyway, and they're all a bunch of race hustler activists, and they're being commissioned by organisations that are in turn, NGO race hustler activists and or fronts for the Soros type groups and so on. So you'd have to treat their assertions with great suspicion. Now, they do the old time-honoured trick of saying, well, if the outcomes are different, then the cause must be racism, and that racism must be done by evil white fascist Nazi Hitler. And so that's the path. It's a well-worn path that they always go down, and facts and reality be damned. So let's have a look at that, these assertions, and also go back sort of a little bit in time and see, try and sort of capture the nuance of what segregation, as they call it, was all about. So now, going back to the 1950s, the claim was that racial segregation was an evil in itself, that all children should be educated together in the same schools and the same, with the same lessons and resources and so on. Now, in the face of it, there's nothing wrong. It's very it's Marxist in its language and tones, and it was at the time, and still is today. Very much pushed by communist Soviet agitators and the like. Trade unions were big on pushing this one. And there was a huge cabal of Jewish race hustler activists pushing it as well, ones who were also pushing, gay, lesbian themes and things like that. So what were they wanting? Well, what was the claim? The claim was, or amongst the claims were rather, that white schools had better resources and better teachers and so on, and that therefore black kids were missing out. Black kids were equally capable. They were equally eager to learn. They were equally able to go to Harvard and Yale and so on. It was only these that they had substandard schools that was holding them back. So there was a nirvana, a paradise of equality around the corner if only the schools would segregate, if only schools would stop segregating. Now, the segregation wasn't the rule sort of anywhere or everywhere around the United States at the time, but it was more in the southern states and areas around the South. But was it due to purely just skin color? Well, it was never due to that. Now, you could find situations where I'm sure somebody would say that, but it never really was. Certainly, by my reckoning, it never was about skin color. It was about behavioral differences, and the blacks lived in that side of town, and the school districting at the time was if you lived, the kids who lived nearest that school would go to that school, and given that the school in the black neighborhood, which was 99.99% black, then the black neighborhood, then the kids would obviously go to that school. Whereas the kids in the white neighborhood would obviously go to the school that was in that white neighborhood. So there's no real racism there. So the argument that it was deliberate segregation and you can't go to this school and so on. Now, there were situations where, say, the for example, the kids were 10 miles away from the school. That was a district. If you're within 10 miles of this area, then you go to this school. And there were, say, maybe a small number of black or white kids, for that matter, that were on the border of that, where you could have said, well, in this street, on this side of the street, they should go to that. So there was some minor, disputations and considerations there. Black parents that wanted better for their kids would want them to go to a white school, because I want my son or daughter to be around white kids, because then they'll learn better habits, they'll become more industrious, conscientious, they'll get a better education, they'll be better behaved, and they'll do better. So I mean, nothing wrong with that. That's and there were, without doubt, there were aspirational black parents at the time. This is before the Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, or the Democrat Party's Great Society in the mid-60s, where they started to pour a lot of, they say, well, black people live in poorer areas, so why don't we throw vast sums of money at those poor areas, and then we'll create this nirvana. So once that began, then that changed the composition of black families, where the black people, many of them at least, reverted to the tribalism of Africa, where one woman often has 5, 6, 7 children by different men. That's quite acceptable, and how things are done in wide parts of Africa, the idea of the monogamous relationship is quite rare, and so they switched that. So that changed the composition of the family and changed attitudes and views. If you look at how people like the Malcolm X's of the world spoke, not that you didn't have that black sort of jive street talk thing happening then, but there are certainly the ones that you look back in the 50s and 60s and around that time, there are a lot of very well-spoken black public figures. Now, they're accused of being Uncle Toms, and you talk like a white man. Why do you wear white man's clothes? There was all that sort of rubbish was going on. But some of these people, if you look back on what they were saying at the time, not everything, you don't have to agree with everything they said, but some of them make quite a lot of sense in how aspirational black citizens could improve their situation. Coming back to the education now, instead of presenting it as something where aspirational black kids could go, it was treated as a race thing. So you just don't want, you're trying to divide people by race, and we're going to stop you dividing people by race. We're going to make sure all kids are together. Now, the argument they used to wave around, which was optimistic in the extreme, was that if black kids and white kids are sitting together, everyone is somehow going to magically benefit. It's going to be a magical vibe that's going to make everyone's life better. That was obviously insane and quite absurd. But anyway, the laws were changed. Now, just as a personal thing, do I think people should be denied a right to go to a high school if it's in their district, a right to go, or any school for that matter, simply because they're the wrong skin color? Of course not. Now, but the idea of forcing the white schools to take the black kids because the white schools were better, why weren't they forcing the white kids to go to the black school? It was only ever a one-way thing. It was always, well, you've got more and we want some of it. And that's the classic race grift that still goes on today. And I don't know why it's not being given short shrift, but anyway. So that's the history of it. Now, when the segregated school thing ended, was it a step forward in education? Did education become better? Well, no. If there was any improvement, it was well hidden. Now, the response from white parents was to, if a school became a high crime area and it was unruly and there were black gangs roaming around and this sort of thing, the white parents would take their children out of the school and put them in a private school, or put them in some sort of better educational circumstances that didn't have high crime and didn't have punch-ups with the teachers and the students and so on. Now, this is cited as evil white racism, Hitler. Now, Now, this is where this so-called study today goes. The view that the race hustler folks in the study say is that if we're going to achieve absolute proportional representation at all high schools, which would appear to be their objective, then governments must force it. White parents and white children must be controlled by the state, not the blacks. Blacks don't have to be controlled. It's the whites. It's those damn fucking fascist, Nazi, fucking white supremacist Hitler whites. They must be controlled. The government must control, must threaten them, imprison them, use whatever high-handed tactics are needed to create this supposed social nirvana. Now, they go back to the 1950s arguments, certainly again in these recent studies that I've noticed, that white schools are just better resourced. They come from better areas, as in wealthier areas. They're better resources, they get better quality teachers, and it's a better environment. There's less crime and so on. Well, sure, okay. But why not fix up the black area then? Why not make the black areas less crime ridden? Why not make the behavior of those areas better? Why not sanction the students that don't behave well? But instead, it's no. There's nothing we can do about that. The high crime, poor areas and the ghetto, nothing we can do. That's it. But we can drag down those whites by forcing them to accept bad behaving black students, because that will be equality or something like that. It'll be the paradise, the socialist paradise. So again, it's this very one-way thing that it's white schools that have to. Now, I've got some sort of experience at this. I briefly went to a school in a poor area. This is a high school in a poor area, and then went to school in a much wealthier area, and also I've been to quite a wealthy private school as a younger kid, and so sort of have seen the differences. Now, in the wealthy, in the poor area school, when it came to the parents and teachers association meeting, whatever they call the thing, in the poor area school, nobody would turn up. A lot of the parents couldn't speak English very well, but nobody would turn up. So you'd be lucky if you get 3 or 4 people. And one of those meetings, there was only one person turned up, so they offered that guy the job of president of the association. So the people that did turn up were the white parents. So now the school library had the entry level requirement of books that the Department of Education listed. And that was it. So if you wanted to study or do anything outside of the core sort of reading list, you had to go to a public library, and it was a very very different environment where most kids weren't there to learn, where punch-ups between students and teachers were frequent. The police were around every day, and there were all sorts of incredible things going on that you would think would be part of a violent prison system or something. But anyway, then moving to, that was mercifully brief, then moving to a school in a wealthy area. Now, this was very different. The parents, of course, had much better jobs and were also much more involved. So you go to a parent-teacher association meeting, and the room was never big enough because the amount of parents that turned up. So the parents were very involved in, or far more involved in the children's education. And so the library was, they had to do an extension to the library because parents would donate books. Teachers would say, well, we need more books in, I don't know, history or whatever it was. And then I remember that the teachers used to have, this is in senior high school, used to have barbecues where everybody would bring, $5, for example. I can't remember, I think it was $5. $5, and then the teacher would go to secondhand bookshops, for example, and buy history books for the library. So or whatever the subject was. So the library was extensive. In fact, the library was so good that you really, on many subject areas, you didn't need to go to the public library. The school library was so well stocked. Now, teachers don't want to teach in areas of high crime where they're going to run the risk of getting knifed by one of the students. So the better quality teachers will tend to gravitate towards the lower crime area schools. And as the parents are richer, you get more resources, even though the government money going to each one is exactly the same. The difference is the students aren't vandalising the school in the good area. So the budget that the government allocates to each school for repairs, even though it's the same, goes much further in the low crime area school because there's so little vandalism and so little damage. Whereas the high crime area school, the budget for repairs and maintenance is never enough because of the amount of vandalism. So there's a whole lot of differences there. The behaviour of the parents and the behaviour of the students is different, very different. For example, I remember vividly a lot of the kids who were from the Middle Eastern countries. When I was at this poor area school, they had this view that everything in the school was common property, so they could just go to the medical cabinet in the carpentry room and just help themselves to whatever was there. Or they could just steal the tools, they could steal anything. And if it wasn't nailed down, it was common property which they could steal. And I noticed the assumption that the property was common until they got it in their hands, then it became their personal property. So it was a rather interesting take on what was communally owned. But they and if they were caught by the teacher, they would just start swinging. That was I was quite sort of shocked by this when I first saw it. Kids, 11-year-old kids walking around with flick knives and goodness knows what. So it's a very different sort of environment. And something I've mentioned in videos before is that in the wealthy area schools, some kids were doing some minor level stuff, making paper airplanes and throwing them around and being raucous and noisy relative to the standard of behaviour at that school. And the form master came in, as they still called them in those days, and pointed to a student and said, do we have your father's phone number on file, your work phone number? So suddenly the whole room went absolutely dead quiet. People quietly and very meekly resumed their seats, and good behaviour was re-established instantly there. That's all it took. Do we have your father's work phone number on file? Said loudly for the benefit of all, of course, but that was it. This hush descended on the room. Now, if we take the contrast of a black school in a poor area, do we know which father you're talking about? Why don't you fuck off? You can imagine the difference. If anyone even responded or listened to that at all. Work phone number? He's never worked, you fucking idiot. Very different. So this is the difference in behaviour. Now, where would you want your kid to go to school? Now, these studies suggest that segregation is reoccurring, and it's now worse than it was back in the 50s, they claim, because white parents are choosing to segregate their children. Now, that may or may not be true. Given they focus heavily on are the outcomes equal, then we've got reason to be suspicious. And on top of that, they tightly cherry pick, and it's done by a bunch of rabid activists. So you can treat it all, I think, with a pinch of salt. But let's just on the face of it assume that's true. I actually don't doubt it, because as the schools are more and more reluctant to discipline black students, then the standard of behaviour in those schools becomes worse. Crime becomes worse. Misbehaviour, bullying, all sorts of things becomes much worse. So white parents would be aghast at these developments and would do everything they could to move their children out of that school environment into another school, charter schools and whatever. Move to another area. They don't want to send their children to schools where crime is rampant. It's not something they want. So this is causing that. White parents have better means to achieve that. You know, they've got higher incomes, and that they've got much more time to spend on focusing on their children's education and hoping that their children do better. Now, I've noticed amongst a lot of non-white parents where they have a view that they don't want their children to do that well. They're not interested in. They don't want their children to. I want you to have a better life than I had. I want you to achieve more than I achieved. White, not all, but many white parents do think that. The non-white parents tend not to, especially where they've got this sort of community type concept of things where, well, if you do well, and you get a good job and you start behaving like a white person, then you'll forget about me. So in my old age, when I need your help, you won't even piss on me, and I don't want that. And by the way, do you think you're better than me? Well, you're not, because I'm your mother, and so on. So there's this idea, this perverse idea of elder respect, where they don't want the children to do well, because if the children do well, they would respect the elder less, and this sort of thing. So there's quite a bit of difference tied up in that also. Now, in summary, or just in conclusion here, I don't accept the claims made in these various supposed studies that it's all down to racism and evil white Nazis and white supremacists. That's bullshit, utter and total fucking bullshit. What it is that because the reluctance to discipline misbehaving black students has got to a point where the schools have collapsed into dysfunction, and white parents who have the means to do it, at least, are moving their kids out of the schools into other schools where there's some sort of fees involved that black parents can't pay for, and therefore the schools become disproportionately white, 95% white and Asian and so on. So I think this is what's happening. But the remedy to this, as the studies assert, isn't that there should be a clampdown on black student misbehaviour, but rather white people should be forced to be to engage and commit to equal proportional race outcomes, regardless of whether a student's behaving or misbehaving, and but also wants to keep the affirmative action quota system to support the supposed minorities. So the whole system is simply one to penalise whites and nothing else. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.